My name is Brian Tate, local councillor in Dungannon, and I've been asked to welcome you all here to the opening event of the Charlie Donnelly School on this, the 80th anniversary of his death, fighting for the Spanish Republic and the Spanish Civil War. Delighted to invite or welcome you all here, those who are familiar with Dungannon and those who are not familiar with Dungannon. You're all very welcome, and I hope you have an enjoyable next few days. There's quite a bit of stuff to be getting into, and there's plenty of opportunities for people to get their teeth around the different issues around left-wing politics in modern day Ireland, but also going back to people like Charlie Donnelly and will inspire them to go to Spain and fight for the Spanish people. You have two speakers here who are well known in Tyrone, Tommy McKierney and Feargal MacBholscaidh, and I'm delighted that the two of them are at the opening event. It's a fantastic two of our great Tyrone speakers, I would say, and two who are just blowing them up, but also told them to not go too hard on you tonight as well. There's instructions there to go easy. But it's great to see them. I've listened to them many times, and I could listen to them many times over. You're in for a treat tonight, and I see at a lot of other events. There's plenty to be getting on with. So without further ado, I'm delighted to be involved in the opening of the Charlie Donnelly Winter School, and I'm now calling Eugene McCartan of the Communist Party of Ireland to do the formal beginning.
Good evening, dear friends, brothers and sisters, comrades. I was asked on behalf of the steering committee of the Tyrone Forum to say a few words to explain what the forum is about to those who don't know. It is an honour to be asked to say a few words at this opening of the Charlie Donnelly Winter School, sponsored by the Tyrone Social Republican Forum and the Friends of the International Brigade Ireland, Phoebe. The Tyrone Social Republican Forum was established in 2013. You have to shorten the name of it. It's getting very long these days. To provide a space for members of different political parties, socialists, republicans and trade unionists and individuals to come together to meet and to share experiences. The initial meeting took place in the headquarters of the Communist Party of Ireland in Dublin. It brought together a number of political parties, campaign groups, trade unionists and individuals who were deeply concerned by what was happening to our people on a daily basis. It was a period when we witnessed the massive corporate debt, banking debt imposed upon our people by the European Union, a debt that does not belong to us, nor were the people responsible for it. It is clear robbery of the people's wealth, a massive transfer of wealth upwards to the rich and powerful, and outwards to fill the coffers of the global banks and financial speculators. A period of mass immigration, where once again our towns and villages fall silent to the footsteps of our youth. A time when the external troika of the ECB, the EU and the IMF, and with the active collaboration of the internal troika of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Labour, imposed a massive austerity programme on our people. While here in the north equally, the people are experiencing savage austerity, which is blighting the lives of tens of thousands of people, young and old. The old political and economic institutions imposed on this and our people over a century ago have clearly failed the people's needs. All our people have and continue to experience the pain, while the rich and powerful experience the gain of increased wealth and influence. The forum provides a space for open thinking, a place where people can speak freely, can listen to other voices. The forum gives people a space to discuss and debate and to change one's views if that is what is required. No one group controls or owns it. A place where you have the right to change your mind. The forum is a space where both individuals and organisations can benefit and share education, leading to more informed, thereby more focused and effective action by every organisation. We want to build a new politics centred not on sectional advantage or electoralism or otherwise, but to fulfil what James Connolly pointed out: Ireland without its people means nothing to us. So politics without the people being central to everything is simply meaningless and just more of the same old Tweedledum and Tweedledee. We want to build a political movement where our people can intervene and decide on what matters, to intervene and effect change on issues that concerns each and one of us in our daily life and in our place of work. We need to encourage the spirit and self-sacrifice but comrades like Ben Murray or Charlie Donnelly showed when they left our country to fight inside of the Spanish people. It was not for money nor self-gain, but a service of the people, in a great struggle to defeat fascism and to defend democracy and the Spanish working people. Today, we need to understand and learn from the past looking forward, not allow ourselves to be prisoners of the past. Our forum is making its own small contribution, but nevertheless important contribution, of lifting our people's vision of a possible better day. A better day achieved through more focused and strategic struggles. That tomorrow will be a better day if, as the people see through the fog of deliberate confusion by those who now control our destiny. To see more clearly where our real interests lie, to see through the tinsel and the spivs and the chancers. Education is essential in achieving this, and that's what the Tyrone Forum, Social Republican Forum, is committed to aiding and supporting. So with those few words, I'd like to say to declare the winter school open, and looking forward to the two papers tonight. So with those few words, thank you for listening.
As well. But the thing that I'm going to talk about, and I've been warned to try and reduce the amount of verbal diarrhea before the talk tonight, so I'll cut it down to a bare minimum. And I'll also, if you want to ask questions, I don't have a man-flu, so you can ask me 20 questions I just like after the talk, and I'll keep it brief. I'll also be mindful of the fact that talking about left republicanism in a room full of left republicans and socialists, I'm going to be talking about a different type of sectarianism tonight as well, so we'll keep it as brief as possible. But my talk is going to focus really on left republicanism here in Tyrone, in East Tyrone in particular, and it's going to try and trace very, very quickly, as quickly as possible, the antecedents of left republicanism in Tyrone. And sometimes the best way to try and explain what something is to very quickly say what it's not. So I'll talk very briefly about loyalist reaction in Tyrone. I'll talk about bourgeois nationalism, and in the context of this I'll be talking about constitutional nationalism and elements within republicanism to revert towards bourgeois nationalism. And bourgeois nationalism, for the uninitiated, in those days would have been called Hibernianism. And Tommy will probably tell you what the modern day name for bourgeois nationalism is. I'll also talk a wee bit about the Court Enlightenment. And Court Enlightenment, in this respect, will be a brief description of the way that history is used as a means to try and subvert left republicanism in the present day, but also to try and underplay the popular agency of the working class people in Ireland throughout history. What E.P. Thompson would call the enormous condescension of posterity. The fact that the struggles of working people in Ireland and the struggles of working people in East Tyrone, and East Tyrone was by no means unique within Irish history, have essentially been airbrushed out of the historical record. And then I talk, and the majority of the talk actually will be on what the talk is actually meant to be about in the first case, which is left republicanism in East Tyrone. So I thought that the best way to try and start here was to talk about what is this left republicanism, and to talk about the tension within left republicanism. And when he was 90 years old, Charlie Donnelly's comrade in the Republican Congress and the comedy column Public Down says that I think I was never on the winning side in anything in my life. But he reflected back on his time at the time of the treaty debates, and he talked about the people who sided with the Republic, and he clearly felt that there was a tension between those who sided with the Republic from what he would call a sort of a very nationalist perspective, and those who sided with the Republic from a Republican socialist perspective. And he described people like Michael Conroy and Billy Pilkington and Tom Maguire, people he had a lot of respect for, as the kind of men who make murders, but I don't think they make revolutions. And this really is the idea that, I'm talking to you from the perspective, from a Marxist perspective, is the idea that the objective conditions that created Irish republicanism were essentially based in class struggle. And the working class people throughout Irish history have had an allegiance and adherence to Irish republicanism because of their material conditions, but that this manifests itself in different ways. And in some respects, in the introduction to his great book, The Gates Flew Open, O'Donnell painted the other side of this, or talked about this, I think, in a more lucid way. He says, we who took the Republican side in 1822 did not distinguish ourselves in the way we served the great cause, but in the division of the national forces of the time, we were the custodians of the tradition of struggle. Ireland's hope of independence still rests on that large and respectable section of the people, the men of no property. That hope may have to wait for realisation on a great thaw in Belfast that will release the working class population there from their bigotry and their backwardness. And O'Donnell's allusion to Tome's concept of the men of no property really speaks to where republicanism emerges from. It emerges from the Enlightenment and the transmission of the ideas of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution to a colonial context in Ireland. And Irish republicanism has often been portrayed as a very unrealistic perspective, given what people call the idea of the two nations, or you hear an awful lot about orange and green on the TV at the minute. Irish republicanism is firmly based on the acknowledgement of the religious divisions within this country. And it's an acknowledgement that Ireland was a colony, but that the only way to transcend these divisions is the transcension of these divisions to the creation of a new civic concept of the nation, of what it is to be Irish. And it's a civic concept based on the rights, universal rights of the French Revolution of freedom, liberty, equality and fraternity. So, my argument would be, and I'm sure many people in the room would agree with it, is that, if we want to try and tackle sectarianism within Ireland, then it has to be done in terms of the elevation and transcension of these divisions in terms of religion, and a more progressive and equitable future on the whole island. Now, the problem with this, I would suggest, is that the way that politics has been engineered, and I've used engineered quite deliberately here, is to try and present this very Republican idea as either completely unrealistic or a fraud, basically a veiled type of very irredentist Irish nationalism. And that goes back to the way that the current political institutions in this country, and particularly the partition north, are based on the principle of consent. And I think that Irish republicanism and Irish republican socialism, by extension, have to try and challenge the idea of the principle of consent, that there are two nations in Ireland. And if we go back to the United Irishmen and we look at what they talked about, we talked about the Republican ethic, and Tom Paine spoke with us at the time, is that each generation gets to make its own social contract, that these divisions that were in Ireland between orange and green are not immutable, they're not permanent, there are great examples of our history of cooperation across the religious divide. And the United Irishmen said themselves, McCracken himself, before the Battle of Antrim, of course, says that the rich always betray the poor, but he went on and he talked about republicanism. He says, are we forever to walk like beasts of prey over the fields which these ancestors stained with blood? And if you hear any of the current election rhetoric, you'll see that some people are quite intent on beating the drum and talking about past divisions. Now, in Tyrone, this found voice within a unity between dissenters and Catholics, and there was a fellow called John Cashel, who was a watchmaker from Mahonacloy, and he described this unity as based on liberty and equality. And the flip side of this tradition in the East Tyrone area was summed up by Thomas Knox, who was the first Earl of Glenfordy, who described the alliance between the aristocracy, the Protestant ascendancy, and a newly created organisation called the Orange Order. The Orange Order, who in a private letter he described as licentious Orangemen, who I would normally have nothing to do with, but I'm now prepared to work with for the preservation of our lives and properties. So the current notion that you're able to try and transcend or overcome sectarianism by engagement within institutions that are firmly based on sectarianism, or the idea that the Orange State is somehow changed in its sectarian character because it's now the Orange and Green State, seems to me sort of counterintuitive. and that there needs to be some sort of reversion back to the founding principles of Irish republicanism. And the founding principles of Irish republicanism are quite clear in that there are no two nations in Ireland, that republicanism is about the creation of a civic nation based on republican concepts, and as republican socialists, obviously, we probably are the inheritors of the most progressive aspect of the French Revolution and the revolutionary tradition. So I side very much with what Connolly said in his court march. He says that the British government has no right in Ireland, never had any right in Ireland, and never can have any right in Ireland, and furthermore the British rule constituted a usurpation and a crime against human progress. And Connolly's great dispute with William Walker led to perhaps the crystallisation of two traditions within the Irish left, what I would call Labour of aristocracy model, or an imperial socialist position, and also then a radical left republican tradition. And to finish this idea about leading yourself down a cul-de-sac, which essentially is what some people from the Republican movement, I would argue, have done in terms of their acceptance of this idea of the principle of consent and the idea of two nations. Connolly in 1914 was under no doubt that loyalism was a form of reaction, that it was backed by those reactionary elements within the British Empire and the British establishment. And he says that but as no good can come of blaming it, that's the loyalist working class, he said, so also no good but infinite evil can come of throttling to it. So to overcome reaction and anti-progressive elements within Irish society, it's no good playing footsie with those elements. It's no good coming to some sort of accommodation with them. I think they need to be challenged. And a more progressive and a republican alternative needs to be presented to the Irish people. And a republican socialist alternative at that. So that's the Connolly quote. So what do I mean, and what did Connolly mean about a crime against human progress? The crime against human progress idea is that there are trends, people who claim to be off the left, who attempt to portray republican socialism as atavistic, as obscurant, as a very anti-progressive and narrow nationalistic perspective. But if we look at the chief theoreticians of the left, Marx and Engels, they were under no doubt that the Irish Republican struggle, or the struggle for Irish national independence, was in and of itself a class struggle. And Engels very famously said that there are two nations in the world that should achieve national liberation before they achieve social revolution, as Ireland and Poland. And Engels, as a young man here, said Ireland too was a colony, and in it was not a trace of the English citizens' so-called freedom. In no other country have I seen so many gendarmes or policemen. Marx himself described the famine as a fiendish war of extermination, and it was at the time of the Fenians when perhaps both Marx and Engels achieved a very mature appreciation of the Irish struggle. And again, the reason why I've included this quote in a letter from Marx to Engels after the execution of Alan Norton and O'Brien and the Manchester murders is that Jenny, his daughter, goes in black since the Manchester execution and wears her Polish cross on a green ribbon, a strange sort of a type of symbolism for an atheist. But what was meant by that was a display of solidarity with the national liberation struggles in both Poland and in Ireland, and there was an appreciation from both Marx and Engels that Fenianism in and of itself was the expression of class struggle in Ireland, and perhaps the most progressive element of that class struggle. Engels replies, obviously, because he was married to an Irish woman, that he need not tell you that green is the principal colour, black is the principal colour in my house as well. But the crux of the situation, and we'll get on to Lana very quickly, is that Marx, in a very famous letter in April 1970, says, in Ireland, the land question has so far been the exclusive form of the social question. It is a question of existence, a question of life or death. For the immense majority of the Irish people, at the same time, it is inseparable from the national question. That the national question is the social question in Ireland. And then this picks up the Lenin's very famous quote after 1916 Rising, that whoever expects a pure social revolution will never live to see it. Such a person pays lip service to revolution without understanding what revolution is. That the manifestation of class struggle in Ireland was, in this respect, The most progressive currents within the revolutionary tradition in Ireland in 1916, that was obviously James Connolly and the Irish Citizen Army. The argument that I'm trying to make here is not some sort of carte blanche for Irish nationalism at all, and again, you don't need to go too far within Marx or Lenin, or in particular the great James Connolly, to clearly show that nationalism in and of itself is not sufficient. That if unionism, loyalism, reaction have their own lumping element, if you want to put it like that, then Irish nationalism had its own lumping element. In the period that I'm going to be, as briefly as possible, talking about, this could be very clearly identified with the ancient order of Hibernians, and with the way in which working class people who are engaging in political activity because of concrete social positions are directed towards the class interests of the Irish middle class. So, in a very early letter on Donnelly O'Connell in 1843, in which he famously says, Engels famously says, "Give me 200,000 Irishmen and I'll overthrow the British monarchy." He also says that if O'Connell were really the man of the people, if he had sufficient courage and were not himself afraid of the people, i.e. if he were not a double-faced Whig, but an upright, consistent Democrat, then the last thing these soldiers would have left Ireland nonsense. If the people were to be set free even for a moment, then Donnelly O'Connell and his moneyed aristocrats would soon be just as much left high and dry as he wants to leave the Tories high and dry. That is the reason for Daniel's close association with the Catholic clergy. That is why he warns his Irish men against dangerous socialism, and that is why he rejects the support offered by the Chartists, support that the Fenians would subsequently accept. Although for appearance's sake he now and again talks about democracy. And that is why he will never succeed in achieving anything but the political education of the Irish people, which in the long run is to no one more dangerous than to himself. Now this is not some sort of specifically Irish species of national struggle. These tensions and this between the conditions that created the demand for national liberation and the way that it manifested itself in politics were felt particularly in Poland, but again much later, if you read the work of someone like Franz Fanon and the idea about the bourgeois nationalist revolution. And if you want to go back to France in 1789, and the manner in which the bourgeoisie employed the working class and the third estate in order to achieve their class aims. And I find this quote from Rosa Luxemburg talking about the Polish bourgeois nationalists, and they thought, you know, we could be Rosa O'Donnell as opposed to Rosa Luxemburg. He said, these leaders of the people want the people only to think of their language and their Catholic religion, but not about their empty stomachs. And she goes on about the manner in which the nationalist bourgeoisie in East Prussia object to the Germanization, but essentially do nothing to alleviate or improve the conditions of ordinary Polish workers. So, this is what I wanted to very briefly try and nail down was that perhaps the best way to understand left republicanism is in having an appreciation of what it's not within this local context, within the national context. It's clearly not aligned to reactionary loyalism, and it's also in opposition, but also in some sort of tension with and cooperation with a form of bourgeois nationalism. And you know, you could say that we come again to a dialectical crossroads. I don't like using words like dialectical in lecture too often, but so the nationalism in itself has proved sort of antipathetic or against the social revolution. The class struggle and the demands for social change have constituted the engine of nationalism. That it was the objective material conditions of ordinary people that actually drove forward the Irish nationalist liberation struggle. And we have to then try and understand why, you know, there's been cycles of revolution in Ireland and uprising in Ireland that seems to be clearly, in a very mechanical manner, linked to the deprivation and oppression of the Irish people, but that we've been in cycles of revolution and counter-revolution. And Connolly, I think, is the person who hits it right on the head. And it's the idea that the dominant class, despite the fact that the backbone of these movements have been working class people, the dominant class within most of these national movements, not all of them, have come from the Irish middle class. So So when Connie, before he made that, this is his last article, for the 1960 invasion, he says, we are out for Ireland, for the Irish. But who are the Irish? Not the rack-ramping, slum-owning landlord, not the sweating, profit-grinding capitalist, not the sleek and rowdy lawyer, not the prostitute pressman. And, you know, you'd think he wrote it last week. The heirs of the enemy put the Irish working class. The only sure foundation upon which a free nation can be built. So, my big argument would be that there's a danger of trying to oversimplify this. And the danger is that you throw the baby out with the bathwater. That Irish republicanism in and of itself has never really delivered the goods in terms of social justice and the proper form of the social revolution. Therefore, people may think there's something defective and wrong with Irish republicanism. My argument would be that there would have been no progress made in Irish history without these Irish Republican uprisings. And in fact, that no future progress, because of the historical conditions of this country, can be properly made, I believe, without the synthesis between what would be the demand for a social revolution by the working class in this country as a hegemonic class, tied to the ideology of Irish history, of Irish republicanism. That there has to be a synthesis between them. Or what Gramsci would have said was that the Irish people need to replace the common sense of constitutional nationalism or bourgeois nationalism with the good sense of socialist republicanism. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the time or the capacity to try and ever say how we're going to do that. But Gramsci's theory of hegemony, I think, offers perhaps the best way to try and describe and understand this tension. And he says that there has to be a more complex synthesis of class objectives with themes that have arisen. Out of the original and unique history of each country, only when hegemonic interests are welded to the national popular will can the ideas and aims of the revolutionary class become deeply rooted among the people. So the idea here is that you can't sort of superimpose socialism from outside to Ireland was in what George Rudy would call a derived type of ideology, and ideology in this idea being the way that people understand the word. But there has to be a synthesis between what popular struggle has meant in Ireland and where, as socialists and Irish Republican socialists, we want to take it. And I think that's why and where Gramsci's theory of hegemony probably offers what we were talking about in terms of education and understanding. Now, again, the best way to perhaps try and talk about this is to look at the example of history in Tyrone. But before I do that, as an historian, it would be amiss of me not to try and attack some other historians. So, and the way that Irish history is, the predominant manner in which Irish history is presented in the universities. And I've called this the Court Enlightenment, which is a concept that goes back right to someone like John Locke's treatment of Ireland. Is the idea that the people who hold power and the people who actually enact the oppression criticise the oppressed because of the lack of their enlightened ideas and their civility and progress. It's and this is also another reason why I think this sort of, you could call it alliance or a Northern Ireland Office Party talk about, you know, orange and green and everybody just getting on and wouldn't this be a good place, doesn't work. The idea that some sort of solution here based on the existing 6 counties ignores the historical record and historical agency of the British state in Ireland. And they're trying to do their best but forget about Irish history. And Chomsky has a great line. He says those that hold the clubs are very keen that, you know, the oppressed forget about history. It's those who are beaten by them, you know, would need to remember the past. And what essentially is happening is that Irish republicanism and Irish republican socialism, there's been a concerted campaign, an attack on it, particularly on popular Irish republicanism and the agency of working people in Irish history. So one of the high priests, if I could use that word, of the Court Enlightenment is someone like Roy Foster, who, you know, from what he would describe as a very progressive and liberal perspective, essentially tries to undermine impulses for significant social change during the Irish Revolutionary period. Someone else, like the late Peter Hart, very famously said in his book, The Red War, that there was no social revolution in Ireland. There was not even a prospect of a social revolution in Ireland between 1916 and 1923. So this idea that not only did it not happen, but it was never going to happen. And the next sentence is, and it never should happen. So what does someone like Foster say? Foster says, traditional approaches to understanding revolutionary change in terms of class or ideology seem inadequate today, because he obviously doesn't agree with them. We search now instead to seek clarification through themes of paradox and nuance. Nice, woolly, generalised words that don't really mean anything. A good way of talking about a lot of this work would be, polished turds. So, what is history written? History is written, and the type of history that I try and write very much comes from the idea that history from below, the perspective of English Marxist historians like A.B. Thompson, or great Irish historians like Feargal Campbell, Jim Smith. And it's the idea that we have to guard against the way that the establishment employs history to negate the strength of popular mobilisation. And Thompson says that this is because the source base, be it primary sources from the time or secondary sources, are written by the articulate minority. The people in history who have the leisure and the resources to sit down every night and write what they thought and send letters, or people who were employed by the state to sit down and write things. And the people who are actually engaged in class struggle and engaged in radical politics tended not to have, in earlier periods, the education and the literacy to this, and secondly, the time to accumulate this level of source base. So how are these left Republicans in Tyrone typically described in the source record? Well, this is a police report describing the IRB in East Tyrone the year before the 1916 rising. It describes them as lacking in character and intelligence and may be ignored with absolute safety. They were all working class, by the way, this is another thing. So, not only is it typical of the class condescension, it's also not a very good prediction given the fact that almost a year later the 1916 rising takes place. But this feeds into the way that history is written in this period, and I haven't strayed too far from the time yet, and I will get it finished. This feeds into, this very same police report is used by an historian called Matthew Kelly, and he says, marginal concern at the rate of Catholic enlistment can have been little enhanced by 16 men in a field, stamping their feet, rubbing their hands, and with frosty breath, plotting revolution. Okay? So this sort of idea about these people are wasting their time. This engagement in popular revolutionary activity is a waste of time. This is quite interesting because the field in question was in Killybrack. It was the old engine brigade of the IRB and the Irish Volunteers. Now, what is this all about? This is about the idea of undermining the popular revolutionary character of what happened between 1916 and 1923, and also transmitting the idea that it wasn't progressive, it was anti-progressive, and it's not worth doing anything now either. So if you look at the way that another very famous Irish historian, who's actually from Australia, David Fitzpatrick, the head of Irish history at Trinity College Dublin, described ordinary people in Clare reacting to the British state clampdown after the 1916 rising. He says, by the sporadic exercise of force majeure, by interference in public assemblies, arrests, trials and imprisonments, the castle, Dublin Castle, made heroes out of nobodies and provoked savage indignation among countless families which had previously supported the new movement, if at all, only out of herd instinct. Now, there's not many things wrong with that passage that would be here all night, turn it to pieces, but look at the language that is used in terms of popular agency. These people are nobodies, and they're all part of a herd. And as soon as I read that, I thought about this fine gentleman, Walt Whitman. And he says, in quite a few years after what was happening in Clare, he said the general population were too stupid and ignorant to be allowed to run their own affairs. The task was to be left to the intelligent minority, who must be protected from the trampling and the roar of the bewildered herd. And this is about the manufacture of consent, and very much what is taught in TCU, in Trinity College, was taught in Queen's University Belfast, was taught in UCD, transmits itself into the Irish Times, and transmits itself probably in an even more obnoxious form into the independent. And this is what people hear about the revolutionary period. But, and I'm going to actually disagree with Paddy O'Donnell. I would say that actually the liberties and what progress has been made in Irish history and in international history is because of the agency and the struggle of these people, of ordinary people, demanding their rights. And that a great history, and Conley says this in Labour and Irish history, the great history as it really was what Rankin and these guys wanted. We have to write the history of ordinary people, the people who constituted 90% of the population, and the people who made their own history. And this is what A.P. Thompson criticises in his classical work, The Making of the English Working Class. He says, "But so great has been the reaction in our time against Whig or Marxist interpretation of history that some scholars have propagated a ridiculous reversal of historical roles. The persecuted are seen as forerunners of oppression, and the oppressors as victims of persecution." There's plenty of that going on in the newspapers at the minute, and people crying in House of Commons and stuff. So, I would argue actually that this is where the real kernel of history is. This is where the real engine of history is. This is what Tyrone talks about in terms of popular mobilisation. Popular mobilisation, in what Gramsci would call during an organic crisis or a war of manoeuvre, is the grand gestures of history, the 1916s, the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. But Marx's own mould is tunnelling all the time. And at every period in history, it's the agency and the struggle of ordinary people that brings about significant change. And then says, we don't have to engage in grand heroic actions to participate in the process of change. Small acts, when multiplied by millions of people, can transform the world. And if you want to try and understand the IRB and Tyrone and left Republicans in Tyrone, I think this is where we need to do it. And I will give you a couple of examples of this. Is that the caricature of the people engaged in Republican politics spheres from the ridiculous to the sinister. They're presented either as fools or as bigots. So you have a picture of the ARB in Tyrone as some sort of, highly aggressive nationalists with guns, just waiting for their chance. All these guys sitting in a pub with beards, polishing guns, waiting for this revolution. When in fact, what the life and the history of this community suggests is these are people who engage in struggle and the demands for a more democratic society across an entire generation. So these are the people who grew up with Tom Clark before he left the area. And the first quote comes from Hugh Burney, who was an associate of Tom Clark. He was the deputy head of the Fenians in Dungannon, and he addressed the local Fosters in January 1898. He said that he was proud they were all sons of the tide, and that it displeased whom it may, the working class must have the right to manage their own affairs. He said all Irishmen in sympathy with the commemoration of the 1798 movement, irrespective of the altar which they need, would be welcome to join. And then he quotes Thomas Davis. He says, "Irish born Marn, if you're to be true, we heed not grace nor creed nor clan, we've hearts and hands for you." And essentially what the IRB and Dungannon did was they channeled their activity through an organisation called the Irish National Foster. They built the hall down at the corner of Ann Street, and they used this as the hub for an awful lot of progressive politics in this area from the early 1890s right through to the revolutionary period. So a really good and I'd say quick example of this is when 4 years earlier in the Foster's Hall, local Presbyterian and poor Lord Guardian called John D. Crockett told his audience that, and this was a talk about trade unionism and the formation of trade unionism, and the Fenians essentially established nascent trade unionism in this area. He said, "Let the wage be what it may, human beings ought to give the least possible amount of time compatible with supplying the necessities of life to industrial or manual labour. A poor man's labour is the only capital he has, and he ought to sell it in the market to the highest bidder." He said that the great majority of these who are poor, and some current politicians should probably get a spoonful of this, he said that the great majority of these who are poor and affected with poverty are poor not by their own fault, nor by their own choice, but because of the conditions imposed by society at large. Poverty is not an individual or personal crime, but a social crime. That being so, it is for you to devise some means of regulating your supply of labour through the demand made for it in the beginning. And then he goes on, and I don't have time, but he goes on to attack the Catholic Church, the Presbyterian Church, and the Church of Ireland in the time. And now, I can assure you that there's some former students of the Systematics by the Academy here in the beginning. I was never taught that people were giving socialist speeches in the 1890s. Surprisingly enough. What does this lead? It leads to agency. It leads to the foundation of the Ulster Labourers Union in the area, and there are here 9 branches. It leads to strikes, and it leads to attempts to engage in local politics. So while the meeting in support of the candidates in the Foster's Hall again selected to represent the working class, John McElvoe, the head of the Fenians in Dungannon, stood for election because of the 1898 Local Government Act. So unfortunately, Brian McHeath thinks he's the first independent Republican councillor in Dungannon, but he was beaten to the prize by about 100 years. It says, on a meeting in support of the candidates selected to represent the working class, McElvoe claimed other nationalist candidates were all connected directly or indirectly with House Lords. McElvoe wanted to explode the old theory that it was only men with money, whether they had brains or not, were fit to look after the affairs of the town. No influence, high or low, could prevent them going to the poll. Hugh Burney again looked forward to the routing of the old rotten aristocracy who never did any good to the town. And McElvoe was actually returned. He was elected as a Labour councillor, and he thanked the 120 voters in the West Ward who recorded their votes for him and for the cause of Labour. The Fenians then set up the Ulster Labourers Union, and they received cross-denominational support. Catholics and Protestants joined them. This is an example of a strike in 1888 at the Congo coal mine, which again is just beside Killybrackie, just out from Killybrackie, and was one of the proudest, maybe proud is not a good word to use, moments of my life whenever I took the court proceedings of this to my grandmother and showed her that her father got a month's hard labour for beating up a strikebreaker in Congo coal mine. And this was members of the Fosters who were also members of the IRB, who worked in the mine. The mine collapsed and killed 3 people. They demanded that they improve safety, they refused to improve the safety, and they went on strike. They formed a picket. And the police again were obviously used to try and help the black guys get into work. But the point here is this, is that the antecedents of what happens during the Irish Revolution are from the same people who have been struggling in terms of the national question. But as Mark said, the national question in Ireland is the social question. These same people are the people who are engaged in the Irish Volunteers and the Irish Republican Brotherhood in 1916. These are also the same people who engage in a wave of industrial action after 1918. And they engage after 1918 because the conditions are right for such activity. And there's a wave of strikes in Tyrone, in East Tyrone, and these strikes cut across, again, to use the rhetoric of Naomi Long, this terrible orange and green divide. So, the first thing that happens is in 1917 in Killeen, I would suggest, is sort of like the Eastern version of the Ruhr. In other words, it's heavily industrial and very militant. So, I may be overrating the wee bit. So there was a strike in their own spinning mill in Killeen between July and November 1917. And it began on the issue of pay. The workers should be paid recognised wage, same rate as the Flax and Spinners Association for the district. Okay? They gain that. And then their next demand, and I'll not tell you who the employer is in this picture because I'm sure you should work out who he is. Where 3 non-union workers were taken on and the other workers went out on strike, with the result that the non-union workers joined the union, so then they achieved a close shop. And this was all done by what was called the Workers' Union, which was a Covenant union from Belfast, led by Sam Kyle, Dawson Gordon, and other Protestants. Kyle and Gordon both were elected to Belfast City Council. Gordon was the president of the Belfast Trade Council in 1920, and they were elected. Sam Kyle, a Covenant socialist, topped the poll in the Shankill Road. Okay? These people did an awful lot of work here in East Tyrone as well. Gordon was the main speaker, the main voice behind the mobilisation of mill workers. It began in Killeen, most of the people engaged in it were also members of the Irish Volunteers, but it quickly moved to Dungannon, and it moved to Dixon's and Stevenson's mills, and it moved to Adair's mill in Cookstown. And this time it wasn't just Fenians who were involved, and I use Fenians in the political sense, not in the derogatory sectarian sense. It was also Protestant workers. And Dawson Gordon gave a speech in George's Hall, which isn't too far away from here, to Catholic and Protestant workers, using the Dungannon example, a practical example, as a means to try and spread trade unionism. He said that Dungannon workers could fight as well as those in Killeen who had now been fighting for 5 months, and were going to continue fighting until they would get what they were out for, and it was believed from the support they were getting all over the country that they would get their demands. He went on to say, they lived during a period of history of some people when nothing else could be done except to try their strength for the other side, and the strongest side won. As far as Killeen was concerned, the society was the strongest side. Gordon believed that the dispute had done a great deal of good, because the employers and again in Cookstown would realise that the society was fairly strong and being able to fight a strong battle and at the end win. Now, this is November 1917, and what essentially happens is the workers' union is established in Dungannon and Cookstown, and that they achieve their demands without going out and strike. This then spreads out into the countryside, and I'm very conscious that I'm rapidly running out of time, but this then spreads out into the countryside. And one of the key areas where it goes, there's another strike in the Ruhr or in Killeen in March 1918, and then there's a strike in Dockmore at the soapworks. So I'm very conscious of the fact that, you know, our Spanish colleagues probably don't know where Dockmore is, but the people from the end, it's very, very famous soap factory in Dockmore called Colleen Soap, and 140 workers were out on strike in Brown's soapworks in Donaghmore, again Catholics and Protestants, and the workers' union picked the factory. In fact, these two fellas, Charlie Donnelly and Robert Stewart, hijacked the company lorry and drove it through their gates. Okay, they parade the town or the village. Sorry if anybody's from Donaghmore, but it's only just a village. I get enough out of stick in Belfast off being from Dungannon, so it's nice to put good to somebody else. And they parade the village with a red flag and up the workers written on it. But the problem is that Brown then employs people on increased wages on a sectarian basis, and he sends the people who are working in the factory out the Union Jacks. And this is a local manifestation of something that happened particularly violently and vehemently in Belfast, where that reactionary loyalism is employed in order to jettison or to undermine and essentially smash working class solidarity. This reached its apogee in this area in Callan, where the exact same tactics are used by the employer. This time, you can actually see there that 150 people went out and strike in Fulton Woolman. Fulton was indeed an Orange Man unionist, a good friend of Fred Crawford, Tiger Crawford, who organised an armed gunnery and was essentially the link man between the UVF and James Craig. And Crawford's retelling of this strike has nothing to do with reality of what the strike was actually about. Crawford writes in his diary, the Catholics struck to remove Protestant foremen, and the Catholics have come in and filled Protestant servicemen's jobs. He also says that the Catholic priest, the leader of the Sinn Féiners in the district, organised the strike to persecute Protestants. Okay? In reality, the strike was organised by local members of the Orange Order, who had heard about Potter O'Donnell's Soviet in the Mulholland Asylum, and had invited Potter O'Donnell to Caledon in order to try and get them an improvement in wages and conditions. Okay? And O'Donnell found very gradually the Union Jacks gave way and the red flags took their place, and you had 150 workers, most of them Protestants, parading through Caledon village, and again people who aren't from here will not know how strange this sounds, with a long big drum at the front and a red flag at the back of the parade. So, and this is from the Ormore Guardian, who's definitely not a paper that would be sympathetic to Potter O'Donnell. And he says, almost every night the strikers parade through the streets headed by bands following the red flag. Now the Voice of Labour claimed that enthusiasm is at fever pitch with National Union of Railway men cooperating. A citizens' police force was established, and the orange band parades and cheers for the Transport Union. So these are orange men, members of the Irish Transport and Workers Union. How does Fulton counter this? He locks them out, and then he implies Protestants only on increased wages. But 14 families, Protestant families, refused to go back to work, and they actually emigrate to Lancashire. So, you know, Caledon becomes probably one of the worst villages for sectarianism, and there's several serious sectarian atrocities on both sides in Caledon in 1921-1922. 2 years earlier, the inhabitants of Caledon were marching down the village with a red flag and a land drum. So you can see how revolution very quickly turned into counter-revolution. And in July 1919, Fulton holds a social in Caledon, and he has a big banner. July 1919, Caledon's double celebration, overthrow of the Hun and Irish Bolshevik. So, now, I've really overstepped my brief here, but this continues, and it continues after partition, and there's a strike in the brickyard in Yennon. Samuel Kelly buys a brickyard, and Dawson Gordon's back, and the strike, and again it's broken on a sectarian basis, and I'm getting wings here, so I may wind her up. I think the best example of the way that this continues is at Honour Gallery in 1924, where Samuel Kelly bought the brickyard and he also bought the coal mine. Right? The brickyard taught him a valuable lesson: don't employ local people in Killeen. I told you about Killeen already, haven't I? Don't employ local people in Killeen, they're trouble. So he went over to England. He said, I'm going to get my miners in England. But he didn't realise that unemployed miners in England were principally unemployed because they'd been kicked out of the mines for being militant trade unionists, and he employed a load of communists from Durham and the west coast of Scotland, and brought them over to Killeen. And he said, so their first proposal was that the management should meet a committee of the men each week. This was regarded by the management as purely communistic. Right? The police described the strikers as absolute Bolsheviks in their attitude, and the leader of the strike, a man called Shaw from Durham, was an out-and-out communist. Put it like this: there was no more coal produced in Killeen after 1924. Samuel Kelly had enough of it, and he closed the mine down. So I'm actually finished now. But the serious aspect of this point is that, and as I say, before I did any research on this, my picture of Tyrone and the Irish Revolutionary period in Tyrone was very much based by the impressions that were presented to me in the school and what I got elsewhere. It was only when I actually looked at the amount of working class agency and the idea that these concepts of orange and green and blocks are not immutable, that there are actually examples in this area where working class people came together and cooperated. But it was a heavy hand, not just of loyalist reaction, but of nationalist, of bourgeois nationalism, was well who played their part in undermining local trade unionism and local republicanism. That there is a legacy there is something that Gramsci would talk about in terms of the national popular will. There is a fine division in this area and across this country of working people trying to create a better society. A better society. These people were dedicated to solidarity and mutual aid. They were defeated mostly by force, but the battle is far from over despite setbacks, often violent repression, and massive efforts to instill the divine maxim. This is Chomsky using Adam Smith's idea about personal self-interest in the public mind, with the resources of educational systems, the huge advertising industry, and other propaganda institutions dedicated to the task. And I let Tommy come in just with probably my favourite quote from Chomsky, and this is just because I've been basically talking about a catalogue of failure all night since I've mentioned Colorado Allen at the start. But the finish is, it says, if you assume that there is no hope, you guarantee there will be no hope. If you assume that there is an instinct for freedom, that there are opportunities to change things, then there is a possibility that you contribute to making a better world. And if we learn anything from our ancestors and our grandparents, great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents, is that they have a life of struggle, and they try to make the society and the country and the world that they lived in a better place, and we wouldn't be properly fulfilling and do justice to their legacy if we didn't try and do likewise.